During World War I, Japan invaded parts of China. But what the world didn't know was that deep inside occupied territory, Japan built a secret laboratory, a place where Japanese scientists performed unthinkable inhuman experiments on Chinese civilians. They called it Unit 731, officially a disease prevention center, but in reality, it was a factory of death, a place where science was twisted into pure cruelty. And behind those experiments stood a chilling goal. The Japanese government was determined to develop the ultimate biological weapon, a silent, invisible force that could wipe out cities without firing a single shot. This is the story of Japan's darkest secret, a chapter the world tried to forget. When the First World War ended in 1918, the world lay in ruins. Millions were dead, empires collapsed, and entire societies were rebuilding from devastation. While Europe grappled with its losses, Japan quietly strengthened its military and expanded its influence. Having sided with the Allies, Japan occupied German holdings in Asia, including parts of China's Shandong province. And from those gains grew a conviction that Japan was destined to dominate East Asia. The 1920s and 1930s brought modernization, pride, and a growing militarism. Scientists and military leaders found common cause: the belief that technological and biological superiority could secure empire. In this climate of ambition, the idea of weaponizing disease moved from fringe theory to state strategy. In 1931, a staged explosion on the South Manchurian Railway, the Mukden incident, gave Japan a pretext to invade Manchuria. Within months, Japanese forces controlled the region and installed a puppet state, Manchukuo. Far from Tokyo's prying eyes, the military began to assemble projects that no public policy could justify. One of them was Unit 731. To the outside world, it was labeled the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. Behind the walls, however, it served the state's most sinister objective: to produce data, methods, and the biological weapons Japan believed could secure its imperial future. Leading the effort was General Shiro Ishii, a medical officer who blended scientific skill with ruthless ambition. Ishii argued that biology could become the decisive instrument of war, and he secured military backing for an enormous secret compound near Harbin, in Manchuria. Built with fences, watchtowers, and armed guards, the complex covered miles and housed labs, barracks, and execution areas. Prisoners, civilians, prisoners of war, and foreigners were kept in cells and moved through the facility as if on a conveyor belt. The researchers refused to treat these victims as people. They called them maruta, meaning logs, objects to be cut up, measured, and cataloged. What happened inside Unit 731 defies the language of standard medical research. Survivors and later testimonies describe a catalog of cruelty. Frostbite experiments froze limbs until tissue turned to ice. Doctors then burned or cut away flesh to study nerve and vascular damage. Vivisections were performed on conscious prisoners, organs exposed, lungs sliced, stomachs opened, while victims were fully aware and unable to feel relief. Infectious agents, plague, anthrax, cholera, typhus, were injected into subjects to observe progression, contagion, and mortality. Sometimes entire villages near the compound became unknowing test sites. Contaminated water, plague-infected fleas dropped from aircraft, and deliberate contamination of food and wells to measure the pace and reach of an outbreak. Records compiled by Unit 731's researchers read like cold laboratory logs: temperature, incubation time, survival rate, while the human cost was recorded as nothing more than data points. Conservative tallies place the direct death toll inside the compound at several thousand. When field tests and spread of disease are included, estimates rise dramatically, possibly into the hundreds of thousands. The driving purpose was chillingly strategic. Japan's military planners envisioned biological weapons as a force multiplier, a way to break armies and terrorize civilian populations without conventional invasion. Plague bombs and infectious aerosols, they believed, could erase cities, collapse logistics, and force political surrender while conserving troops and firepower. The state poured resources into Unit 731 to transform theory into operational tools. Every experiment, every dissection, and every epidemic simulation was intended to refine methods for producing, storing, delivering, and denying attribution for biological attacks. In the language of the researchers, they were producing usable knowledge. In the language of the victims, they were producing mass death. By 1945, the tide of war had turned. As Allied forces closed in and the Soviet Union prepared to enter the conflict in Manchuria, Unit 731's operators attempted to erase their tracks. They demolished buildings, massacred remaining prisoners, and burned records. Yet destruction was incomplete. Fragments of evidence survived: notes, photographs, and the testimony of a handful of survivors and local witnesses. The greatest moral outrage, however, came in the aftermath of surrender. Secret negotiations took place. American investigators and intelligence officers recognized the scientific value of Unit 731's data. In exchange for exclusive access to that information, the United States provided immunity to many of the leading perpetrators. Men who organized and directed experiments that violated the most basic human rights were spared trial. Their records were never fully exposed in public tribunals, and some returned to civilian life as respected professionals. Justice, in the formal sense, had been sidestepped. For decades, Unit 731 was omitted from official histories. Japanese textbooks remained silent. Survivors and victims' families were marginalized, but memory cannot be completely erased. Beginning in the 1970s and gaining momentum in the 1980s and 1990s, journalists, historians, and survivors began to tell the story. Documents, photographs, and on-record testimonies exposed the truth. Today, the remains of the compound near Harbin are a museum and memorial. Visitors walk among ruins and displays of surgical instruments and documents, confronted with evidence of how a modern state harnessed science to inflict barbarity. The museum stands not only as a record of crimes, but as a warning. Unit 731 is more than a historical atrocity. It is a lesson. Scientific knowledge divorced from moral responsibility becomes a weapon against humanity. The men who wielded scalpels as instruments of terror were not monsters from myth. They were trained doctors and officers, operating within a state structure that rewarded results. Their work reminds us that ethical limits are not just academic, they are a shield against catastrophe. We must remember these dark chapters, not to fix blame eternally, but to ensure that the pursuit of knowledge always remains anchored to conscience. Science can heal the world, but without humanity, it can destroy it. Even today, the shadow of Unit 731 stretches across generations in China. More than 80 years have passed since the experiments ended, yet the memories remain raw, transmitted from survivors to their children and grandchildren. In cities such as Harbin, Nanjing, and Shenyang, remembrance has become part of local identity. Every year, on anniversaries of the invasion and surrender, crowds gather at memorial sites, carrying white flowers and silent banners that read, "Never forget." For many Chinese families, the trauma of Japanese occupation is not abstract history, but inherited pain. Stories of relatives who never returned, of villages that vanished, of sickness that spread from sources no one could explain. The wounds are generational, carved into collective consciousness. At the same time, official narratives in China have turned remembrance into a form of national unity. Museums, such as the Unit 731 exhibition hall in Harbin, stand as both historical archives and moral symbols. School groups visit to learn what unchecked militarism and cruelty can do to ordinary people. The exhibits display preserved artifacts, surgical instruments, photographs, even letters from scientists, forcing visitors to confront the uncomfortable truth that human beings, under the banner of science, were capable of unimaginable evil. Yet the purpose of these memorials is not revenge. It is vigilance. As guides often explain, remembering is a defense against repetition. In contrast, public memory in Japan has been more fragmented. Some Japanese historians and activists have fought to expose the truth and apologize sincerely. Others, however, continue to downplay or deny the extent of Unit 731's crimes, calling them rumors or propaganda. This denial deepens Chinese resentment. Many Chinese citizens feel that reconciliation cannot be complete until full acknowledgement replaces silence. The result is a delicate and often tense relationship between the two nations. Official diplomatic statements may emphasize peace and cooperation, yet under the surface, mistrust lingers. Still, the story is not entirely one of hatred. In recent decades, cultural exchanges, tourism, and joint historical projects have opened limited spaces for dialogue. Younger generations in both countries, raised in an interconnected world, increasingly seek truth rather than propaganda. Some Japanese volunteers have worked alongside Chinese researchers to preserve evidence and testimonies from surviving victims. When those collaborations are publicized, they often spark cautious hope that moral courage can outlast politics. For many Chinese citizens, forgiveness is complicated. It is not the absence of anger, but the insistence that history be remembered honestly. We cannot forget, says one inscription at the Harbin Memorial, but we can choose to build a future free of hate. In that sentence lies the modern Chinese attitude toward Japan's wartime actions. Remembrance without erasure, awareness without vengeance. The ghosts of Unit 731 will never vanish, but they now stand as guardians of memory, reminding both nations that science, power, and patriotism must never again combine to dehumanize. History cannot be rewritten, but it can, if faced with courage, teach humanity to remain human.